All right. Yeah, if you're spending way too much time on the intro, then it's all downhill from there. So I first of all want to say that I'm very excited to be out here at the monument. I started coming here when I was a tiny child, and like a lot of other people that grew up in Houston, playing on the now gone battleship was one of the high points of my childhood. And it's great to be here talking to you. So we are going to talk about 3 stories from this book, which is one of the nonfiction books. And I did bring copies of this, and I brought copies of my new historical fiction book as well. A couple of odds and ends that I'll have out there after we're done. This has 48 stories from all over Texas. And the earliest one dates from the 1530s. And the latest one goes into the 1980s. So I tried to give as diverse an array of stories as possible. There are so many great undertold stories, and some of these, let me first of all just take a half second and say, undertold does not mean untold. So some of these you will know something about, some of them you may know everything about. I taught this class at Rice, and I was really surprised that out of the stories that I covered there, and these were adults, it was continuing education. So these are people that, mostly Rice grads that take those things. And very few of the stories were anything that they had heard of. So we'll see. Hopefully it's not, for a lot of you, it's not just the same old stuff. I tried to pick things that are lesser known Texas Revolution stories for the first 3, and then we will have a Lanyap story at the end. So we're going to start, in theory, talking about Fannon's pocket watch. And Lisa Struthers, who is the librarian here at the monument, will know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that Texas Revolution artifacts are, as I put it, the confluence of provenance, research, desire, and greed. And that's what we're going to talk about here. And you'll probably, some of you have followed the stories that were connected to the Phil Collins collection that the Alamo got. And there were, first of all, I did a documentary series, and we're finishing up the very last one of 8 full-length documentaries. In doing that, I happened to be at the Alamo filming when they were unboxing the Phil Collins stuff. And it is pure luck. It was amazing watching some of these things, including full canon that are being unboxed for the first time that the Alamo curators were seeing. So that was really cool. The vast majority of that stuff, there is no question about the authenticity, but there are a handful of the items there that have gotten a lot of questions. And one of them in particular, 2 of them in particular, are knives. One of them said to belong to Travis, and one said to belong to Jim Bowie. And both of them, you'll see down here, the last 3 things there. The Travis knife had his initials on it. And there was a guy, the provenance chain for that, the guy that had sold it to the guy that sold it to Phil Collins said, no, there were no initials on that. He goes, I saw this knife for years and it was a fake. It was absolutely no initials on there. The people that sold it to Collins said, well, we just gave it a good polish and the initials popped out. And that was a story that came out a few different times. But I mention all this to lead up to the artifact that we're eventually going to be talking about. And it's connected to James Walker Fannon, who was born initially James Walker. Fannon was his father's name. His parents were separated, and he took his father's name about the time that he went to West Point. He was not a good student at West Point. He flunked 1 year and ultimately left early. Just to kind of give a little tip-off to what his behavior was going to be when he got to Goliad, he wrote two different versions of his resignation letter at West Point because he really couldn't decide exactly what he wanted to say. He came to Texas, and at the start of the revolution, as people still weren't exactly sure if they wanted to be part of a federalist Mexico or be totally independent from Mexico, Fannin, at the time, there were not a lot of military trained people here. Not a lot of people here at all. But the ones that had military training, like Fannin, who had been to West Point, even though he did drop out, he thought that he should be given command of all the Texas Army, the official Texas Army. And when that did not happen, he bore not even a grudge, a hatred of Sam Houston for the short remainder of his life. There's not a lot. One of my good buddies is Steve Harden, who's written a lot of Texas military history. And I think his words were that there is not a lot to recommend Fannin as a hero of the Texas Revolution. And I agree with that entirely. However, he was heroic at the siege of Behar in December of 1835. So the Mexican army under General Cos had occupied the Alamo and occupied San Antonio. And right after the Battle of Gonzales, the skirmish of Gonzales in early October of 1835, that army and other people kept going to San Antonio and laid siege. And there are little battles and fights that happened there. And one of them was the Battle of Concepcion, named after the mission of the same name in San Antonio. And Fannin was co-commander of that little group. And he was outnumbered. They got an excellent position there along the river and chased a superior number force back to San Antonio. And he fought well. Kind of downhill for Fannin after that. He went to Goliad and was put in charge there. And to take that back to the Alamo, at this point, the Alamo was besieged, and Fannin is in Goliad. Houston, as commander, Sam Houston, as commander of the army, had already told him to leave, that Goliad was not a defensible position. And he said, get out of there and head toward at least as far as Victoria, if not further up the coast. General Urrea was the one that was leading a Mexican force up the coast, basically, and was heading towards Goliad. Had already knocked out some other groups, and I'm not going to go into all of that detail because that's not part of our story here. Fannin said he was going to go to relieve the Alamo at one point and packed everybody up. They made it a few miles, and basically he changed his mind. He used a broken ox cart wheel as an excuse to turn around and go back. And we all know what happened at the Alamo. So Fannin kept getting these orders to leave Goliad, and he finally did. Waited too late, but finally did. Made it again, just a few miles up the road towards Victoria, when he decided that the oxen had not eaten. And so he stopped in the middle of an open field and let the oxen graze, decided the men will have lunch, and some of his officers are going, if we went another mile over here, we'd be in the cover of the trees, and that would be a better place. Fannin said, no, we'll be fine. Well, sure enough, Urrea, his troops show up, and before you know it, Fannin and his men are surrounded, roughly a force of about 400. And that's the Gary Zaboli drawing of that. They formed square, which was what he was taught at West Point, and they fought really bravely. The Mexican troops immediately tried to knock out the cannon, the people manning the cannon, which Fannin had put at the corners. You can see there. So that was what they went for first. part of stopping in the middle of that field meant that they had also no water. Cannon, when you're shooting them, they get very hot very quickly, and there was nothing that they could cool them down with because they had no water. People are wounded. Nightfall comes, they're cold. This was in March, and it was still cold. And the next morning, they really didn't know what they were going to do, but by then Urrea's artillery had come up, and he fired a shot from a large artillery piece, basically right over the heads of the Texans, just to let you know, this is what we can do, surrender. So they did. Contrary to what some people will tell you, it was an unconditional surrender that Fannin signed, and they were taken back to the Presidio in Goliad. The Mexican troops were suspicious because they thought that the Texans had poisoned the water well. The Texans had destroyed some of the food sources. So most of the not seriously wounded folks and the people that were not wounded were put into that little chapel, the Loretto Chapel there at Goliad. If you have been there, if you haven't, it's a great place. You should go visit. But most of them were crammed in there. It was crowded. They couldn't even all lay down to sleep at night. The food was kind of tossed to them because the Mexican guards didn't want to go in and risk any sort of attack. So it wasn't a good situation for those men. The wounded, which included Fannin, were kept separately. This is a quote here. This is from Jack Shackelford, who was a doctor. He was with the Alabama Red Rovers, which was one of the more populous of the groups that were in Goliad. And I put some quotes up here because they tell way better than I could what was going on. I cannot resist an inclination to mention one more incident of that evening, the last evening of many, very many gallant spirits. Many of our young men had a fondness for music and could perform well, particularly on the flute. In passing by them to visit some wounded on the outside of the fort, my ear caught the sound of music as it rolled in harmonious numbers from several flutes in concert. The tune was Home Sweet Home. Poor fellows, it was their last earthly evening. And you know what happened in Goliad? Pretty much everybody died, with a few exceptions. 26 exceptions, I think, is the number, something like that, if I'm remembering off the top of my head. But it was because of the policy that Santa Anna had adopted. It was called the Tornel Decree. The Tornel Decree was named after the Minister of Defense for Mexico, who had written this up. And basically, any Anglos that had come to Mexico under arms were pirates, and they were going to be killed. Urrea did not stay in Goliad after the battle. He left, and he left in charge Lieutenant Colonel Jose Nicolas de la Portilla. And Portilla pleaded with Santa Anna through couriers and through written messages to not execute all of these troops. The record still exists, and I think later this year, Greg Dimmick will be here, who has done more research in those Mexican archives than anybody I know and has a couple of books coming out. And Portilla wrote a cruel contraste between what Urrea had told him, which was to treat the prisoners well, especially Fannin, and what he was being told, which was to execute all of them. I will say here that in the two previous battles, one of which we'll get to in a little bit, Urrea had executed his prisoners. So there is history today that will tell you that Urrea fought to save those lives at Goliad. It doesn't quite mesh with what he had done previously. So 3 groups, the massacre story, you know this, I'll breeze through it. 3 groups were marched in different directions, thinking they were going to board ships to go back to the United States, and instead they were executed. Like I said, 28 escaped in the fog of musket smoke, and the other 340 bodies were left to rot in the sun But what about the wounded? Well, an young Irish guy that was there at Goliad and was spared, wrote this. The wounded were placed in the corner of the yard upon which the church door fronts. A company of soldiers formed in front of us and loaded their pieces with ball cartridges. Then a file of men under a corporal took 2 of our number, marched them out toward the company, and after bandaging their eyes, made them lie with their faces to the ground, after which, placing the muzzles close to their heads, shot them as they lay. The second one is about a particular guy, and you'll see that he was also shot, another guy that was wounded, very popular engineer that was with the wounded there at Goliad, and he was stripped of his watch and thrown into a pit. So that brings us to Fanon himself. Fanon at first asked to speak to Portia personally, and Portia refused. Instead, he got to talk with, in Fanon's eyes, negotiate with, but there was no negotiation going on. He got to talk with a captain from the Tres Villas battalion, and the captain was very polite. The accounts actually said that at one point, Fanon said, I want you to get this watch back to my wife. It's very important to me. I want you to not shoot me in the face. I want you to make sure my body is sent back so I can have a good burial. And the captain supposedly bowed to him, nodded and bowed, and promptly had people shoot him in the face, roll him into a common grave with other people at the side of the road, and steal his belongings. And that brings us to the artifact. And I could not resist, if any of you know the quote, "What watch such much?" from Casablanca. The watch is a beautiful thing, and it's in the Dallas Historical Society little museum now. Displayed, I will point out that 2 engravings are on the back, one of them supposedly from Fanon's day, and one of them supposedly connected to the battlefield here, the battleground here. Fanon is misspelled in both cases. So it was found here at San Jacinto by William Houston Jack, who is the brother of Patrick Jack, who was, if you think back to the Anahuac disturbances, Patrick Jack and William Travis were the 2 main instigators at Anahuac. There were 2 disturbances, but anyway, Jack was involved in that. So Jacksboro, Texas, and Jack County are named after those brothers out in West Texas. And the story is that William Jack took this watch off of one of the dead soldados or officers here at San Jacinto. That was commonplace. There were looting on both sides. There's plenty of record of that the Texans looted Mexican bodies, Mexicans looted Texan bodies. There are some very prominent artifacts that have a similar story, that they were taken here at San Jacinto. The problem with this watch is that Urrea was a totally different army. His people were not here. The Texans that escaped, those 28 that escaped, that all happened before Fanon was killed. They were marched out before the wounded were taken out to be killed. So how did that watch get here if that's the actual story? The only possibility would be that somehow that Tres Villas captain sent it off to Santa Anna personally as a trophy, and that it was looted from his baggage here on the battleground. That is not what usually happened. All of those other artifacts that I talked about, they were kept by the founders keepers kind of premise, and that's why they showed up for years and decades and even a century later, because they had been taken back. And there are all kinds of stories from all kinds of wars. Very rarely like I can't think of another one, do they actually get handed up the chain of command. So make your own decision as to whether or not that's actually Famines Watch. Next up, we'll talk about another guy that had a run-in with urea, Dr. James Grant. And for starters, there were 3 James Grants. And I'm already over my allotted time here per thing, so I'll not read you all of this. But you can read very fast as I'm talking about it. There were 2 others that were in Texas. The guy that we are talking about is Dr. Diego Grant in Spanish, and he was a medical doctor from Scotland. And we know this. There was an excellent book that Stuart Reed, who's one of his descendants, wrote called The Secret War for Texas. And a lot of this stuff that we're going to talk about in this little segment comes from that. So our James Grant was born in Scotland, 1793, which puts him a little bit older than a lot of the participants in the Texas Revolution. He had studied medicine. His allure that got him the later jobs is that he had traveled. He had been with the East India Company as a doctor. So he had traveled around the world. And he eventually got a job in London that he didn't like and was ripe for the picking when the British government came and offered him a job. He wrote his aunt back in Scotland, and the letter is one that still exists. And he said that he would be going to Mexico as senior physician and medical superintendent of large concerns of Real del Monte Mining Company and in medical charge of the embassy. So this happened in the 1820s. Grant, by the way, Mrs. Grant, this was also in the letter, remains behind for the present with the children and is provided for by the company. Mexico had just finished their successful, very long revolution against Spain in 1821. So the British, much like when Texas finally got recognized as a republic, the British did not grant Mexico an embassy. They granted them a consulate, the same way that Texas got a consulate and not an embassy. And they sent a charge d'affaires down to Mexico. And 1825, I think, is when they established that. Mexico had a lot of minerals, in particular silver. They had a lot of silver that British interests wanted. And that was Britain's main interest in establishing that consulate, was they wanted to protect their economic interest, all of those people that had invested in silver mines in Mexico. So that's why they primarily were interested in Mexico at that time period. But they could also see a map. And here's the United States, which had the Louisiana Purchase a couple decades prior, and it's right up against Mexico. And the British understood that the United States could keep expanding, and that was not something that they wanted. So that was a secondary interest of the British, was to keep the United States at bay. And they sent this guy, Henry George Ward. He was, the official job was he was handling the diplomatic relations. He had written a book about commercial interests in Mexico, British commercial interest in Mexico. So he was considered an expert. But in reality, he was the spy master for the British government. And James Grant, Dr. James Grant, became one of his spies. Got sent to Texas a few different times. Clandestine visits, and one of them involved the Fredonia Rebellion, which is, again, a whole topic in and of itself, but it was one of a few different rebellions that basically pitted older colonists in Mexico, both Anglo and Tejano, against newer arrivals, Anglo, and people trying to make money off of giving old land to new arrivals. The Fredonia Rebellion falls into that, but it's more. because the British had an interest. And a couple of these different things that happened in the 1820s and 1830s also had a native Texas Indian element to it. The British wanted to establish an Indian colony with as many as 20,000 of these Indian tribes that they had invited in, Cherokee and all the allied groups, which did not number remotely near 20,000 people, but they wanted that many to be there as a buffer for more growth from the United States. So Dr. Grant is involved in that. And when that didn't work, when it failed miserably, Ward was abruptly, is the word that they used, recalled to London, but Grant stayed. So remember, his wife and family had stayed in Britain. Well, that didn't bother Dr. Grant. He just got a new wife and family. And married this woman. He got a nice house. That is not it. But when I was looking for a picture of Hacienda Los Hornos, I couldn't find one. And so I picked one that would be a place that I would like to live. It's that right there. That looks great, doesn't it? So he was, Grant ended up getting a new job working for a bank and immediately started doing all these different side projects. And he became very important and fairly well off in Mexico at the time. And he was very much a federalist. He did not want the Mexico City government messing in his business interests. So he became a hardcore federalist. And it was kind of an ongoing civil war that was happening between the centralist in Mexico and the federalist, and Grant was all in for the side that most of the Texans were involved in. He got elected to the state legislature for Coahuila y Tejas. And not only did he get elected as a delegate, he got leadership positions. So this is not a native-born Mexican at all. This is a guy from Scotland, a doctor from Scotland, and he became, most importantly, the jefe de armas, the master of arms, chief of arms. And that was an important thing, and it will kind of figure into the story here a little bit later. He got arrested because Santana, when he changed sides from being a Federalist to being a centralist, he ordered the arrest of all the Federalist leaders. Top of the list was Dr. Grant and this guy who was the governor, Agustin Viesca. And so both of them got arrested. They later got freed. Somebody broke them out of jail, and they took off for Texas. So Grant ends up, after the siege, or prior to the siege of Behar, he ends up in San Antonio. And it was Grant that is credited as being the one that talked Ben Milam into leading that faction when there was debate over whether or not they should attack the town of San Antonio. This is after the Battle of Concepcion that we talked about. There was debate on whether or not to actually attack the town, and Grant was the one that said, yeah, we need to, and he talked Ben Milam into stepping forward and saying, let's lead. Who will follow old Ben Milam into San Antonio is the famous may or may not be true quote. Grant was one of the people that, one of four people, I think, that led a group under Milam as they went in and fought literally house to house, room to room in San Antonio. Grant also, because of his connections in Mexico, secretly held consultations with some of the troops that were in the Alamo complex that were hardcore Federalists and got them to leave. So that was really what caused Coast to surrender, was because a couple of hundred of his men quit and went back to Laredo, where they joined another part of the Mexican army. So that leaves the Texans in charge in December of 1835. And Grant is there. A lot of the Texans went home. They had, remember, started this campaign in October when it's still nice weather. and it's now December, and they didn't have coats, and they missed their families. And a lot of them went home. So it's a small group that's in the Alamo, and Grant and another guy, Frank Johnson, decide that they are going to take off from Matamoros, which is where Grant's commercial interests were in northern Mexico. And they want to take off to Matamoros, and they want to basically take the fight to the Mexicans on their own Mexican territory, or their own Coahuilan territory, because Texas, of course, is still Mexican territory. That, again, the very short version is that led to the downfall of the provisional government, because there was so much debate in Texas over whether or not this Matamoros expedition, or expeditions, plural, was a good idea or not. It led to the collapse of that government. But Grant was one of the two guys leading it. And he took off. Sam Houston caught up with them in South Texas and managed to talk some of the men into coming back to San Antonio. But Grant and Johnson had taken a bunch of supplies that they really needed. So part of you can make a case that it didn't help the Alamo's fortunes, I'll put it that way, that they had taken off with some needed supplies and some needed men. Would it have made an ultimate difference on March 6th? No. But that's what happened. So I got a little ahead of my slide here. The Matamoros expeditions kind of split apart. Frank Johnson, his small group ended up getting caught at San Patricio. The story is that there was a advance notice given by Urrea that said, leave a certain light on in your window and we'll know that you're a loyalist and we won't attack you. And that Johnson was up writing reports late and had a lamp in his window. So he was not attacked, but the rest of his people were. And that was one of the ones that Urrea executed prisoners. Grant ultimately got caught in far northwestern Nueces County. That's where Corpus is, but this is the other side of Nueces County, away from the bay. And Grant got caught there and killed. The story is, that's best I could do on him getting a lance through his body. But the story is that he was either knocked from his horse or dismounted, but then a lancer got him through the back. One of the very undertold stories from the Texas Revolution, and I think just a fascinating guy. The British interests in Texas were long-reaching. And in fact, on this Matamoros expedition, there was a guy that Grant knew from the British East India Company that was with him. So evidence says that he was still, through all of that, maintaining a relationship with His Majesty's government and trying to do what he could to make sure that the United States did not get their hand on Texas. All right. Francis Moore Jr. Anybody know this name? How many people are longtime Houstonians? I'll put it that way. Okay. He was your first big mayor. There was a mayor before him, a guy named Holman, that died very shortly after, but Moore was the first really robust mayor of Houston. And fascinating guy. The son of a Harvard-educated doctor, and he was going to follow his father's footsteps and become a doctor, and he studied to be a doctor, and then the family moved to Western New York, and he started studying to be a lawyer instead. He also taught school. He learned geology and the sciences. He got interested in all of this stuff. And like I said, just a really interesting, well-rounded guy. He also lost an arm in a childhood accident. So throughout, from teenage on, he was a one-armed guy, which led to a great quote from Sam Houston that we'll get to in a second. So, like a lot of people, Francis Moore Jr. caught the Texas fever. And there was money to be made, there was land that was to be had for free, or nearly free for paying a surveying fee. And so he and two brothers that were friends of his, the Kruger brothers, left Western New York and took off for Texas. And they got here, again, like a lot of other people, they got here too late. The battle here at San Jacinto had already happened, but they managed to hook on with an Ohio unit. Thanks to his doctor training, he got a medical role with that unit, and they ended up being the personal guards of David Burnett, who was one of the top politicians in Texas at the time. And then that lasted for a few months, and then they were out of that job. He ended up buying Moore, and one of the Krugers ended up buying the newspaper, first in Columbia. And it was the Telegraph and Texas Register. And that's your masthead there. They only owned it in Columbia for a couple of months, and then the government and everything else moved up to Houston, which really kind of didn't exist. But that became the interim capital, and the newspaper and the printing press moved with them. So Moore, Steve Hardin described him as a blue nose, because he really honestly thought he was better than pretty much everyone else in Texas. He didn't like the drunkenness, and he didn't like the lawlessness, certainly not the dueling. He would write all kinds of editorials about dueling, and really didn't like anything that was going on. He had picked the exact wrong place for someone of his sensibilities to come, was to Texas. And this is the quote I was talking about. Houston hated him and said, that lying scribbler of the Telegraph, whose one arm could write more malicious falsehoods than any man with two. So this is just one incident that happened. And much like I am not related to the vice president, I am also not related to John Vance of the story here either. Yeah. Horse racing was a huge thing in Texas, and in Houston in particular at the time. There were a couple of tracks. One of them was called the Post Oak Racetrack, and it was basically, if you can picture West Dallas and Montrose, that intersection. The Post Oak track was out there. Sam Houston owned racehorses. Everybody owned racehorses and bet large money. They would have purses that would run as much as $1,500, which was a lot of cash. And that, according to some of the accounts that were written later, that was dwarfed by the amount of side betting that was going on. So this was a big thing. And there was, if any of you live west side of downtown, from like the southwest corner of downtown all the way down to almost Rice University, your house is probably in the Obedience Fort Smith League. That would be on your deed. And she had a bunch of kids, 10 of them, if I recall, and the youngest ones were twins, and there was a bad twin in there, and that was Jackson Smith, and he was a big gambler and a big horse racer, owned a bunch of horses, and he got into a shootout at the races. So if you can imagine, this was the biggest sporting event out there. So if you can imagine a shootout at the Texans game, that's what we're talking about here. And he and John Vance had made a side bet on their particular two horses. Vance's horse won. Smith refused to pay. Gunplay happened, and people were killed. And Francis Moore wrote this scathing editorial about it. He did not mention anybody by name, but you knew who the story was. Moore, by the way, I just had to include this. This is one of the other, he was not very popular, as you can imagine, because he's railing against all the fun stuff that people are doing. And somebody had called him slab-sided and knock-kneed, but specifically said he wears the same Kentucky jeans pants, the same pair of stitch downs, the same long and flowing blue-green robe, and the same redoubtable ancient drab beaver hat. Every day he's wearing the same clothes, and people are writing that down. They don't like him. That's his picture right there. So if you can kind of see his superior attitude even in the photograph. But these are the things that he accomplished as a 3-term mayor of Houston. The first city charter, he started our police department, oversaw the building of the first bridge over Buffalo Bayou, Market House, the Plank Road. So he did a lot. And if that wasn't enough, yeah, okay, thought I'd skip one there. If that wasn't enough, he later goes on to a career in the state legislature, and I'll mention a little bit more about that in a second. The biggest problem in Houston at the time were all these furloughed Army soldiers. Like Moore himself, these people had come to Texas looking for adventure. They didn't get it. They started causing trouble, and they ended up all in Houston. When the capital moved here, they all came here. They were not getting paid in cash. They were getting paid in these land certificates that they would sign on the back and give to a bartender in return for a bar tab. And they were fighting every night, and they were killing one another. And Moore hated this, and he wrote editorials one after another about this. Ultimately, there was a murder that crossed the line, and it was one of the 28 that escaped from Goliad. The book Texian Macabre that Steve Hardin again had written is the account of that. And basically, there was a 2-person trial back-to-back that they held in Houston. The second guy was Quick, John Christopher Columbus Quick. And his trial lasted about 15 minutes. They were in a hurry. They sentenced both him and the other guy, David James Jones, to hang. And coincidentally, Jones, the escapee from Goliad, the hanging took place on the anniversary of the Battle of Coleto Creek at Goliad. And in one of the weird things, the early Texans celebrated that massacre date with a ball. And that was the night before. So they conveniently booked the hanging for 2 p.m. so they didn't have to wake up early the day after the ball. But Moore oversaw this first execution in the city of Houston as well. He did go to Austin. He represented Harrisburg County, which is the footprint of Harris County was larger, but you can imagine Harrisburg, Galveston, and Liberty counties took up pretty much most of southeast Texas, and Moore was the representative there in the state Senate. His main accomplishment was he oversaw the establishment of the first college in the state of Texas, which happened at Rudersville in Fayette County, a little bit north of LaGrange. They had to go back a second time because they initially were a Methodist school, and the Texas Republic legislature said, no, we're not going to have a religious school. And so they dropped the Methodist part and resubmitted their charter, and they were approved. He ended up going back ultimately to the north and got a job in Philadelphia working for the Science Museum. And they sent him eventually back to Texas to collect samples. He ultimately made friends with Sam Houston again, and Sam Houston made him the state geologist. And he went out to West Texas, was out there for the better part of a year, found a whole bunch of clues, came back all excited to tell Governor Houston at the time, that we have these mineral riches and we need to be doing something with this. We need to be exploiting this. Well, Moore's timing wasn't great because Sam Houston had been removed from office for refusing to sign on to the Confederacy, and the state geology position no longer existed. And unlike a lot of New Englanders, in particular and Northerners, that stayed with their economic interest and remained in Texas during the Civil War, Francis Moore Jr. stayed with his beliefs and went back to New York. He ultimately died. He had another scientific job in northern Minnesota and died there, possibly from a burst appendix. But he is buried in Brooklyn, interestingly, at the same cemetery where Augustus Allen of the Allen brothers is buried. So two of the founders of Houston are both buried in Brooklyn at that same place. All right. So we're back on track time-wise, Kaylee. The last thing I told you, there was a lagniappe story, and this is not Texas Revolution. But it starts in South Houston, the town of South Houston, which is, unless you happen to live in South Houston or Pasadena, most people don't even really realize there is a town of South Houston. But that's kind of where this story starts. And it's about a guy named Shorty Walker. Born Leslie Lewis Walker, but got the nickname Shorty pretty early, was the son of a Midwest lumberman and a Swedish immigrant mother. And he was one of those guys that grease ran in his veins. He was a mechanic. And he happened to time this as perfectly as possible because automobiles were really just becoming a thing. The first auto in Houston arrived in 1903. And so right after this is when Shorty Walker was working as a mechanic. And you can look at the city directory. It's pretty fascinating because all of the industries associated with it, namely auto repair, being the biggest one because these cars were rather flimsy, a lot of them, just exploded. There are all kinds of auto repair shops, and Shorty Walker is one of the guys that's working there. He had dropped out of college. He went to Oklahoma A&M, which is Oklahoma State in Stillwater, and dropped out, took a job in the Canal Zone in Panama, which is back in the news. But this was when they were building it. He had a job down there as a drill press operator. So being interested in all things mechanical, another thing that was just starting out at the time was aviation. And the Wright brothers, of course, had their flight in December of 1903. And then things in the United States were kind of quiet and on the aviation front. And one of the big reasons is that the Wright brothers wanted to make really sure that their patent was protected. So there's a 2-year period that the Wright brothers were fixated on getting all their patents in order so they could monetize their inventions. And the French, meanwhile, were doing all kinds of experiments and had all these flyers, and that will figure into our story here in a second. But the French never really perfected things. And when the Wright brothers went over to France in 1908 and did their first exhibition, the French kind of collectively, all these aviation engineers are like, oh, it actually can turn, and they actually can steer the plane. So all of this had come together, and that's why you don't see until 1909, 1910, really kind of the next step in American aviation. The first flight in Texas happened in 1910, and it was this guy, French guy, Louis Paulhan, and it happened in the town of South Houston. There, specifically, it was, Spencer Highway and Galveston Road. And there was a land development that was going on out there, and the developer and the Houston Post co-sponsored, and they paid huge money, $20,000, to bring this guy in to do a flight exhibition. He had been doing a tour of the United States and started out in New York and then took a train across the country and had flown at Los Angeles and Denver and Salt Lake City, setting altitude records successively each place that he went. Well, when he got to Houston, the weather was probably kind of like today during the rainy part. And he was traveling with two planes, a monoplane and a biplane, the biplane being more stable. And they didn't fly from place to place. The wings detached and they traveled by train. And then when they got the closest train stop, they would put it on a wagon, and then ultimately people would physically pick the plane up and put into takeoff position, and then they would take off. So it was not like an air show that you imagine today, but it was somebody flying, which no one in Texas had ever seen. Shorty Walker was out there. Cost $1 to get in, by the way. Shorty Walker was there, and he was there with a couple of other buddies of his. You can see here, that's the actual flight that was in Britain, but that's the kind of plane. It's a Farman biplane, and that was what the first flight in Texas was made in. So same year, but that's the same flyer in a different plane. At any rate, that's what I just described. It happened almost exactly this date, but a few years ago. So Shorty Walker, Greasy Smith, and Gus Hahn, all three mechanics, went out there, and they were just bitten by this bug. They wanted to fly. And Greasy Smith ended up, he had a cane with him that he had put marks on, and he very slyly would walk around the plane and measure and then make notes. And they determined at the end of this that they were going to build their own airplanes. Smith and Hahn got together and had a collective interest. They had a garage right there in South Houston. Shorty Walker was going to build his own plane. He was working at a place in downtown, and he went back there and started building a plane. He ordered plans for a Louis Blériot design from France, and figured, yeah, I can build this in the shop here when I'm not working on cars. So he started building a plane in downtown Houston. He could not afford the engine that was suggested in the plans. Not even sure if he could get it in the United States, but he couldn't afford it, so he sent off to the north, to the Midwest, and got an engine. I think he paid $80 or something for it, and got it sent down, and he ultimately built this plane. That's it. That is the plane that he built. So this was the first plane constructed by a Houstonian, the first flight made by a Houstonian. And he basically, he didn't know how to fly. None of these guys knew how to fly. So he went out to a field east of Bel Air, like roughly Bel Air and Stella Link, if you can picture that. And that's where he taught himself to fly, basically taxied around faster and faster until he would get little hops and ultimately fly. Didn't even write down the exact date. Best guess is it was September of 1910. So this is another guy, Benjamin Foulois, who is not French. He's Canadian, French-Canadian, but born in New England, French-Canadian ancestry. And his story, there's so many of these stories, early aviation, and I'm not an aviation expert, but good Lord, some of the stories are amazing. Foulois was in the Army, and the Army in 1909 had bought a plane from the Wright brothers. So go to the source, right? They had one plane. The Army owned one plane, and they had been trying to train some people to fly in Maryland and Virginia, and the weather wasn't great. So they said, you know, we need to send this to Texas. So they put the train, or the plane on the train, sent it down to San Antonio to Fort Sam Houston, and sent Foulois to fly the plane. And he had never flown a plane solo before. He had ridden in it with another flyer, ridden in the one plane that the United States military owned, but he got orders to go to San Antonio, to Fort Sam, and teach yourself to fly. And he did. He actually, and this is possibly the best part, he had to adjust the elevators, the flaps on the plane, and he couldn't quite get them set. So he was writing letters back and forth to Orville Wright to tell him, oh, try this, turn this screw, Yeah, it did take a while. It wasn't, exactly email, but yeah, they're sending these letters back and forth on how they're going to fix this plane and make it fly. So in January 1911, Shorty Walker and Gus Hahn, Gus Hahn and Greasy Smith, all three were involved in this big air meet, and it was the same place out there, Bel Air and Stella Link. The Moisant International Aviators, John Moisant and his sister and brother, the whole family was involved. French Canadians, again, that had lived in Illinois. He was actually born in Illinois, or Illinois, if you want to go that way. And anyway, they were like the big touring company at that time, and they did this big show in Houston, the first big air show in Houston. And John Moisant himself was not there because he had been killed in New Orleans just 2 weeks prior in a plane crash. And if you have ever wondered why, when you fly into New Orleans, your luggage tag says MSY, it's because it was named for John Moisant in his honor. So another one of the flyers that was with him, who is French, Roland Garros. And yes, that is the same Roland Garros whose name is on the French Open tennis stadium. He was an aviator. That, by the way, yeah, sorry, I skipped over one of the, it's another great bit of Houston trivia. It was also $1 to get in. It's the first time, to my knowledge, that anybody ever charged for parking. So Shorty Walker became a barnstorming pilot and flew around for the basic southern middle part of the United States doing these barnstorming shows. This is a great flyer here. J.H. Warden, Fred DeCore, both interesting guys. Fred DeCore bought a plane that Shorty Walker built, bought another plane that Smith and Hahn built. And the two aviation centers in early 1900s were Texas and Southern California. And Fred DeCore actually flew little short hops to get those planes from Houston back to San Diego, which was kind of daring. There were no airports. So Warden is a really fascinating guy as well, ultimately killed in a plane crash, as a lot of these guys were. He's the first military combat pilot in world history. He was half native Indian from New York, I think, and I can't remember the tribe, but one of the New York tribes. But he got hired by the Federalists in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution and took reconnaissance flights down there and also dropped bombs, little grenade-type bombs from his plane. So that is the first military combat on the planet. And after that was done, he came back and was one of these barnstorming guys. He's the first guy to ever fly in Brenham, for example. He would go to different places all over the country and do these same exhibitions, and that's what Shorty Walker was doing. He finally quit because he could make more money as an auto mechanic. So World War I broke out, and a lot of these barnstormers, including Shorty Walker, signed on to be instructors because all of a sudden we're trying to teach bunches of aviators, and there were only a handful of people that knew how to do this. So Shorty Walker was one of them. Ironically or not, he was very seriously injured in a car accident in Houston and was in the hospital for a few months, and that ended his aviation instructor career. When World War I, when the armistice was signed, he was teaching car repair at Houston High School downtown. And he went into car racing after that. So out of the airplanes and into car racing. And this is the kind of car that he was building. That is a souped up Model T Ford. The Chevrolet brothers had invented Chevrolets. I mean, they started that, but then they pretty early on lost control of the company. A guy named Durant ended up starting General Motors, and he ended up with Chevrolet as a brand of automobile. But the Chevrolet brothers started making these cylinder heads to soup up Ford Model Ts, which was the ubiquitous car in the United States at that time. So their company was called Frontenac, and that's one of the cars that's what it looked like when they turned it into a racer. They were called Fronty Fords, and that's what Shorty Walker built, and it's what he raced. And the racetrack was, again, at Stella Link and Bel Air Boulevard. And that remained a racetrack throughout the 1920s and into the early 1930s before it finally got developed as housing. And this is our next to last slide. That is Shorty Walker late in life. I think this is from 1960. Yeah, July 1960. Texas Magazine insert in the Chronicle. And they did a story on Shorty Walker. He was living in Garden Villas at the time, and said that occasionally Greasy Smith would come by and they would do a little hanger flying, meaning having a few beers and telling stories. But he did admit that he had been up in a plane within the last year, but he wouldn't give more information because he didn't want to get in trouble with his wife. Unfortunately, just a few weeks after this story came out, Shorty Walker passed away. But again, what a fascinating, great story about a fellow Houstonian. So volume 2 of Undertold Texas will be coming out early summer, I hope. I'm over halfway done with it. And when I started compiling all these stories, I remember 48 stories per book. I'm pretty much looking at maybe 6 volumes and doing one a year. So if you have a favorite Undertold story, let me know. If it's not in there, then I'll certainly look into it. The Houston one and some of the other, they're split into 8 geographic regions. And Houston and a couple of the other ones they're solid with enough stories. There are 6 per region. I think that math comes out right. 8 regions, 6 stories per region. So I'm at my 36 number for 6 volumes for some of the regions. Some of the other ones are a little bit more difficult for me to find good stories, but I try to spread it all over the state. Thank you all very much.